Hello everyone and welcome to Runetalker, where we talk about Runeterra. I'm Maitland, joined as always by Simon.
Hey everyone.
That was a new little sign on I tried. What did you think of that? What are your immediate thoughts?
Not too bad. Could use a little work, maybe some listener input, but I think it's a winner.
Okay. Well, not the most positive feedback I've ever gotten, but that's fine. We'll work with that and move on. Okay. So it's an exciting time for Runeterra. We have the Last Chance Gauntlet happening this weekend, and so I'm sure everyone wants to discuss lineups, and lineups are honestly one of the most interesting parts of Runeterra, and I think that one of the biggest differences between other card games like Magic the Gathering, and one of the exciting things that Hearthstone did as well, they sort of pioneered this sort of a format where you bring three different decks and ban one. It just adds such an interesting layer of complexity to the strategy that I really enjoy. I believe Simon really enjoys. We can get confirmation from him on that one.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's definitely interesting, and it really hurts my brain. Like, just looking at spreadsheets of matchup win rates and trying to jam things together and, try to figure out what works and what doesn't. It's definitely a lot of fun, and very different to, Magic tournaments where there are three decks in the format and you just practice them against each other. And
and then when you go to a tournament, people are playing those three decks and you know what to expect. And I'm sure you've got to have the same experiences where all of the seasonals, all two of the seasonals that I've played so far, a lot of the rounds I'll sit down and my opponent will have three decks and I'll just be like, okay, what's going on here? Like, there's we do a lot of talking about lineups that we expect and lineups that we think that are good, and what you end up seeing in the tournament is quite different to the expected field.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the really interesting wrinkle about the seasonals, and you end up with 1,000 players, so you just get people who, sometimes with some of the Gauntlet winners, they might not have, that many choices necessarily on what, decks they can actually play. They might only have three decks, so they just bring those along, and they might not be, what you're expecting. Other times you might play against people. I know in the past, in the last seasonal, I played against What Am I, who's a really good player, really high levels master player. And he just had tuned his decks in a way that, I wasn't expecting, and it meant, the matchups that I thought were going to be favoured weren't necessarily favoured, and it put a lot of pressure on me in pick and ban, and I got absolutely destroyed by them. So, the seasonal is always interesting, and it can be really hard to figure out your matchups and figure out, what you're going to expect from your opponent's lineup.
Yeah, and that's sort of the dream, right, isn't it? Is that you predict, you have a read on what people are going to bring, and you adjust your lineup to beat that, and then you run into hapless fools like yourself that have done the predicted thing, and then you get to destroy them. That's a really enviable position to end up in.
I wish I was living that dream. Yeah.
What we're going to do in this ep is we've got two stock lineups that we think are pretty good. Well, I think one of them's pretty good, and we're going to go over sort of thought process around those, and what we think about the decks and what we think about the meta in general. And I think the conversation is going to flow on in a pretty natural way from there.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting episode. We've looked at some data. Dr. Law recently put up a bunch of data on Reddit, which was great, very helpful. We'll link to that for anybody who wants to look at the post, but it's got a lot of different matchup data. So that's where we're getting some of our information for today's episode, so keep that in mind. Yeah,
so the first lineup that we're going to talk about, I think, is close to the best, in inverted commas. I don't know really how you could define something as being the best lineup for a tournament, because it's really dependent on the sample size of people you play against, and it's not really something we have the capability of. You can't fact check me, right? I'm going to say this is the best, and there's nothing you can really do to prove me wrong, I guess is what I'm getting at. So the best lineup, I think, for the seasonal and for the Last Chance Gauntlets in particular as well, because time is a factor, is triple aggro, and I think that these three decks are they're pretty messed up. I think the meta's a bit messed up with aggro at the moment. That I think some people are enjoying it. Aggro decks haven't been this dominant for quite a while because this is extremely dominant. And so the 3 decks we're recommending are Spider Burn, Nightfall aggro, and Discard aggro. And if you've had a look at the matchup spreads for these decks, they are pretty incredible. I'm sure you would have seen these decks a lot on ladder. They are very difficult to beat, and they have some common weaknesses, but it's not simple to be able to beat these 3 decks. And so that's why I think it's a really, really strong lineup, if not the strongest lineup. I think you have to go extremely out of your way to be able to target this lineup and beat it. And I think when you go that far out of your way to do it, I think you end up registering 3 decks that largely suck.
Yeah, I think, anybody who's really trying to target triple aggro, they do have to make some real concessions to have a shot there. The only, deck which is legitimately really good against most of these decks is Trundle Lissandra Control. So that's obviously your priority ban. You're going to ban it every time you see it. But outside of that, you end up in these really awkward situations where your opponent's deck might be favored against, one of your 2 remaining aggro decks and not the other. And like Maitland said, these decks are just really strong at the moment, really resilient, and they have a lot of shared matchup strengths and weaknesses, but a few are a little bit different, which also adds some interesting wrinkles to pick and ban, especially if your opponent doesn't end up showing up with Trundle Lissandra Control.
Yeah, and I mean, my big bugbear with Trundle Lissandra Control is that I think the deck largely sucks. I just think it's not very good. I think it's very good at beating the things that you want to beat, but then, and this is what I envision if I registered Trundle Lissandra Control, is every lineup which isn't 3 aggro decks, I'm just like, oh god, why did I register this deck? And then when I am against triple aggro, they're just going to ban it. So, it's either banned or a big liability. So I'm just, and I think you can sort of get a feel for, at least I sort of get a feel for how I think tournament decks are going to play by playing them on ladder, just in terms of, in the matchup screen when I'm playing on ladder, how often am I like rolling my eyes and being like, oh god, I need to swap to a different deck? Or am I just like, oh my god, this is amazing? And Trundle Lissandra, every game I'm either like, oh, this was a brilliant deck choice, or oh my god, why did I need to delete this list and never play it again?
Yeah, it's pretty polarized for a deck which sees so much play. Personally, I hate playing the deck and I hate playing against it. So I'm hoping other people decide they don't like the deck that much either. But I mean, one big issue that I have with the deck as well is that the deep is a bad matchup. Like, if the deep is a bad matchup for your deck, then like you've really gotta think about why you're jamming this deck. That being said, it is like a pretty good deck. It does have the benefit at the moment of discard sort of being everywhere, but yeah, like Maitland has said, if you're jamming it in your lineup, you probably need to have more anti-aggro tools as well, because otherwise, your opponent's just going to ban it when they have multiple aggro decks, or they're just going to, prey on it when they don't.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing to think about with Trundle Lissandra is, in the last ep or the ep before, I think we talked about how it had around a 50% win rate, and I was questioning, why are people playing this deck when they're losing so much? Question I'd ask myself a lot, because I typically enjoy this style of deck. And now the win rate is looking a lot healthier. If we look at Diamond and Masters for the last 7 days, it's sitting at a 54% win rate, which is really good. But I think that's, it's still the same deck it was a couple of weeks ago. And what's actually happened is that the meta has shifted, and Discard Aggro, Spider Aggro, Nightfall Aggro are all so incredibly good that their play rates have been going up incredibly heavily. And so because there's so much more of them on the ladder, playing a deck like Trundle Lissandra, you're playing against a lot more of those good matchups, which is why its win rate has gone up. But the tournament meta is in no way, the ladder meta is in no way indicative of what people are going to bring to tournaments. And so I'd be really wary of taking that matchup statistic, I would just remember how a few weeks ago in a meta that wasn't as incredibly dominated by aggro, Trundle Lissandra was doing a lot worse. And so that's something I think is important to think about when putting together a lineup for this tournament. That said, we've really gone off on a bit of a tangent on Trundle Lissandra. Should we come back to Spider Aggro?
Yeah, maybe we should keep talking about the aggro lineup, instead of one deck that beats it.
Yeah. So I might go through some of the, from, again, the incredible analysis that Dr. Law put together. Some of the big draw cards for why Spiders is just one of the best decks at the moment. First off, it has a 50% matchup against Spider Aggro, and that's incredible, right? Like, that's
strong. Yeah,
that's really good compared to most decks in the meta. So, yeah, that's really good. It's good against the deep. Obviously, that's where you want to be. It's 60% against the deep, against Shen J4. It is 60% against Lucy and Azir. It's 73% against Shiv Asol, which is a deck that people love to play against their best interests. 59% against Ash, which is a deck that shows up a lot in seasonals. 76% against Teemo Burn, 58% against Pirates, so it beats up on a lot of the other aggressive decks. 69% against Tarmosarak, which is another one that people like to bring to tournaments. 62% against Sedge Rennington, 64% against Fizz TF if people are still playing that. And yeah, like, it's just really across the board. And it's got such fast draws that it's able to really punish opponents. You've got a lot of fearsome creatures, so if your opponent doesn't have, like, that's part of why it's so good against Tahm-Kench Soraka and those decks that don't have early 3-power units. You're able to just overwhelm your opponents really quickly, and your opponent has to be very committed and going super out of their way in order to keep up and then beat this deck. I just think it's one of, if not the strongest decks in the meta, and has been this whole patch, really.
Yeah, it's definitely a strong deck, and you mentioned a lot of its strengths, and when it comes to its weaknesses, it doesn't really have that many. Or even the decks, the popular meta decks where it's not behind by that much necessarily. So against like Thresh Nasus, it's about 47%. Draven Ezreal, it's like 48%. So it's still behind, but really not by that much. And then you really make up for it in those matchups where you're good. So it ends up being, a deck that's hard to target with a lot of strengths. And the fact that it can also be paired with, aggro decks that have similar strengths as well, I think is a really big pull to Spiders for the Last Chance qualifier or for the seasonal.
Yeah, it's just very difficult to beat. And when you look at the decks that do beat it, some of the ones that have the best matchups are the other two decks in this lineup, are Nightfall Aggro and Discard Aggro. And so, yeah, it's a pretty aggro-centric meta, and I feel like the mid-range decks at the moment really struggle. There's just not, I think, the sort of tools that they really need to be able to deal with how efficient the aggro decks currently are, which, I mean, whatever, that is what it is. That's just how the meta is. I'm definitely not commenting on what should be buffed or nerfed, but aggro is just very strong at the moment. So is there anything else that you sort of have to add about Spiders as a deck, or a consideration if you're going to include Spiders in your lineup?
I guess just being aware of sort of the region combo as well, so making sure that, I guess there aren't really any other Shadow Isles Noxus decks, so the fact
that's a big strength,
you're running this list in your aggro lineup, and you're only running Elise as your champion, so it gives you a lot of flexibility when you're playing other aggressive decks. It lets you, free up Draven and some other potential champions that can, go into discard aggro. So that's another big strength for this deck in a tournament lineup.
And for this lineup as well, I think also, Diana Nocturne aren't really champions that get used outside of this deck. There's some Diana control lists, but I don't think you'd be running those with these other lists as well. And Jinx and Draven don't. I guess Draven goes in some other homes, but Jinx is really just in discard aggro. So if you did want to run this lineup, but one of the lists you didn't feel comfortable with, you could quite easily substitute it out for basically anything else. Although I do think you're probably better off just running this lineup because it looks really good and the decks are just all really strong. So yeah, Nightfall aggro, similar to Spiders, is just, again, it's got some similar strengths where it's running the fearsome creatures, so it's really difficult to interact with, and it just has some incredibly powerful combo turns. And this is one that I would say that you probably want to get a number of reps with if you did want to consider it for the seasonal, because it plays out quite differently to aggro decks typically play, and it plays out quite differently to a lot of other decks as well. And there's quite a few different lines that you need a number of reps to really get a good handle on. So I definitely recommend giving this deck a good few runs through the ring before taking it to the tournament.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the play patterns aren't necessarily intuitive, and some of the interactions just like are really hard to wrap your brain around. So I know a big one for a lot of people is when you have the Dusk Petal, which is the burst spell that makes your next Nightfall unit cheaper. A lot of people, like, it takes some practice to really remember that lets you turn your spell mana into unit mana, so you can end up with extra unit mana on certain turns, or do, cute things like playing a Nocturne on turn 3 with some banked spell mana on turn 1 or 2. So just some of those little plays might not be obvious, but once you start playing with the deck for a little while and really looking for them, you'll be able to find them. And also just having more of a mid-range slant than most aggro decks. A lot of the time you might sandbag your 1-drop on turn 1 because you want to be able to enable Nightfall later on. So keep that in mind, get the reps in, and it's just a really strong list right now.
Yeah, how you use like Stalking Shadows is a really interesting card as well when you fit that into your turn cycles, and then when you play the ephemeral unit and when you give up the information of what you picked, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And like you said, yeah, with the Onlooker, if you play that on turn 1 just to have a 2/1 versus if you save it to get the Fearsome later on, there's a lot of small moving parts that all add together, and it's quite easy, I think, to play this deck without a proper appreciation of some of the play patterns. If you just pick this up and just play out and just play your creatures every turn and use your mana every turn, it's going to be very unimpressive and you're going to do quite poorly. Trust me, I've done that. You've really got to do a bit of thinking about it and maybe watch someone who's experienced with the deck play to get a bit of a feel for it, because it is a bit more mid-range and a bit more combo as well on turns.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can get some sort of ridiculous combo plays, particularly when you flip to Diana and you just play a bunch of Nightfall units to make her huge. Sometimes, you can sort of kill your opponent out of nowhere with that as well, especially if they don't go for a block when they should, or if you can flip a Nocturne to give Diana Fearsome in combat. That's another way that you can sort of surprise finish people off. One of the other sort of big strengths of the Diana Nocturne list is, against a lot of aggro decks, just having Doombeast in your list is just so good at helping you win a race, because you get to gain life, your opponents don't, and you want to use your Onto Dusk, which lets you re-trigger Nightfall abilities on your Doombeast pretty much exclusively against most other aggro decks, and that'll be a really good way for you to pull ahead. Notably, Nightfall aggro isn't really that good against discard aggro. You only have sort of a 45% win rate in that matchup, whereas you are, reasonably favoured against something like Spiders or even something like the Teemo Burn lists or Pirates. So just keep that in mind, that you are going to be favoured against some aggro decks and a slight underdog against others, and look for those opportunities to win races with Doombeast. Take Doombeast very highly off, sort of whenever you can, and sequence them well.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really important with the Nightfall aggro list, the Spider aggro list as well, and discard, and I mean all aggro decks really, is particularly in an aggro-centric meta like this, is determining at all times in the game, which between you and your opponent, which of you is the beat down and which of you is the control deck, and that will shift and change throughout the match. And it's really important to identify when you should be holding resources or using them to do damage to your opponent's face, and when you should be using them to try and control the board and keep that board advantage and convert that board advantage into damage to your opponent's face. And something like Doom Beast is incredibly powerful in those situations, as Simon says, because it gets to do both of those functions. It gets to give you more life, hit your opponent for damage, and then also provide the board presence, which are sort of the three most important factors in an aggro mirror. And so, yeah, it's really important that you have a good understanding of if you should be trading off or if you should be holding your creatures for an alpha swing, and that can totally swing these matchups. If you're playing the 3 aggro decks, you're going to be running into some aggro mirrors some amount of the time in the seasonal, and so having a good understanding of how those matchups play out is really important.
Yeah, that can be so huge, and generally because your units are more sort of mid-rangey, you can usually set up some pretty favourable blocks with your units where they might be able to survive the first hit. So definitely keep that in mind. And when you're going for that sort of longer board control style game, Nocturne giving all of your units fearsome on a key turn and potentially shrinking their board is another way for you to sort of kill them in one hit after you sort of stabilize the board. And yeah, that's just another powerful tool for you to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those two decks have really sort of surprised me in how much they've risen to prominence with the TF Fizz nerfs, as well as the nerfs to our poor heroes Fiora and Aphelios. Discard aggro. Yeah, discard aggro, I think, is not really a surprise to anyone. It's been a constant deck in the meta for a long time now. Is there anything you have to sort of say specifically about discard aggro in this meta at this time, at this moment?
I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting about discard aggro and the rest of these aggro decks rising to the top at the moment is, you know, they sort of started getting more play when Fizz TF was the dominant deck, because they were some of the only decks that had a positive matchup against Fizz TF. So it's kind of weird now that, you know, that deck sort of vanished and the aggro decks are still, you know, at the top. It's almost like people sort of forgot how good they were. And there were, you know, a few counters like the Fiora decks and the Aphelios decks were holding them back a bit. But I think that's also interesting that while the meta has shifted, you lost one of your best matchups, but, you know, also losing some of those decks that were preying on you has really, you know, flipped the script. And I think they're going to stay on top for the rest of this patch, particularly for ladder play as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Like, how much of the spider lists now, how much have they changed since, you know, 2, 3, 4 patches ago? I think that spiders has been probably underplayed for quite a while, and I know that it's a lot of people use it as their go-to for doing grinding from iron to masters, because it's just been for a long time very consistently strong, and you have quick games. And I think there's probably a number of psychological reasons that then people move off the deck and move to other things. But I think that what we're seeing now is with these 3 decks is that after a long time of probably being underplayed, that they're finally getting the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, yeah, they are just really strong, really consistent decks. And I mean, I think one of the other commonalities with a lot of these lists is the fact that they do have that reach. They've got the burn spells to be able to finish people off, and there isn't really that much healing in the meta right now. So Targon's dropped off pretty hard. Trundle Lissandra has got healing, but, you know, those reach spells are pretty effective. You know, Decimate's doing pretty well. Even just Get Excited out of discard aggro can be enough to finish off a lot of games. So I think those have also sort of contributed to the rise of these decks. And if you are trying to tune your you know, regular ladder decks to beat aggro, those are some tools that I'd be looking to add, sort of consistent life gain, or even just like, you know, one-off life gain. So for instance, you know, Targon's really the only faction that has that, I guess. Targon and Shadow Isles mainly. But yeah, just adding a few more of those effects to make their burn spells less effective by the time you stabilize the board.
Yeah, and creatures with 3 power is just a huge one at the moment as well, because the fearsome units in Nightfall aggro and spiders can just really overwhelm. If your early defenses is small units, they're just going to run past you before you're able to set up, and so having some slightly larger early units to block is really, really strong against some of these draws.
Yeah, it's definitely huge. So, yeah, I think Discard Aggro is probably one of the best looking decks for this tournament as well. Sort of regardless of the lineup you're going to run.
Yeah, you think? I think that when I look at the data and from my the games that I've played on ladder, for all of this patch, I've been a bit of a broken record saying that I think Spider Aggro and Nightfall Aggro are just busted. And one of the things that's caused me not to play much this patch is that I couldn't find decks that could beat both of those decks without feeling just ridiculously bad against anything else. And Discard Aggro, maybe it's just because I haven't seen it as much. It's risen in popularity, obviously, in the last sort of week or so, I think, considerably. But it just hasn't stood out to me as much as the other decks this patch. What do you think it is that you're seeing there that makes you rate Discard above the other two?
I mean, I just feel like Discard Aggro is kind of like the quiet overachiever that, you know, people talk about how Fiora Shen was a tier 1 deck for a year, but I mean, Discard Aggro kind of has been as well. I think it's just one of those decks that just consistently has a really high win rate. Even though, you know, there are games where you draw a hand full of, you know, unplayable cards, you do nothing, you just have visions, you've got these random O2s, so the games that you lose...
I've
really
never seen a Discard Aggro
hand
that did that.
Okay, that's because you don't play the deck. Yeah, when you play it, every time, when your opponent does it, they're just curving out on you. But, I mean, yeah, I just think Discard Aggro... I mean, looking at its matchup spread, I mean, it's obviously horrendous against Trundle Lissandra control. In terms of weaknesses, it's probably weaker than the rest of the aggro decks to cards like Withering Wail. So I think that is a risk for Discard Aggro, because I think Withering Wail is a card that you can just jam in a lot of random SI lists if you want to make your aggro matchups better. But I think outside of that specific answer, Discard Aggro just sort of has the most explosive starts. It's pretty good against the other aggro decks as well, which I think is a big strength. And I feel like it can just have some absolutely unbeatable openers, even against decks where it should be a pretty big underdog. And the fact that you just get to ban Trundle Lissandra control whenever you see it, I think just pushes Discard over the top as just a really strong tournament option for this seasonal and Last Chance qualifier.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree, and I think that if I do qualify for this seasonal, it probably would take a bit to dissuade me from playing this lineup, just because, I mean, the next lineup we're going to talk about, and maybe we move on to that now, is a lineup that we've built to try and beat this lineup, and it's just not easy. It's just it's really not easy. So the next lineup we're going to talk about, and what we've done to build this lineup is we have looked at that lineup we just talked about, the triple aggro lineup, and we've tried to build a lineup that targets and beats that lineup. And this is typically what I do for every season. This is sort of the start of my approach, is that I look at what are the 3 best aggro decks that we can put together, because I think that's a pretty standard lineup, and then I look at how can I beat that, because I really like to beat aggro in tournaments and on ladder. And this time, definitely much more than other seasonals, it's just incredibly hard to do that. And so the decks that we've put together are Trundle Lissandra, and that's, obviously we've talked about that quite a bit. It's got a 70% matchup into Spiders, it's 70% into Discard, and it's 60% into Nightfall. And that's pretty much why you play the deck, is because it stomps on those 3 aggro pillars, and it gets trounced by a lot of other things, but that's neither here nor there. So that's the first deck. The second deck is Draven Ezreal, which is not as impressive. It's 52% against spiders. So already, right? This is the second deck we've put in the lineup, and already it's like that's even against spiders effectively. Like it's fine. It's 56% against discard, which is pretty good, and 63% against Nightfall, which is actually really good. And there's no other decks really that have a better matchup than that against Nightfall. And Nightfall's got a very impressive matchup spread. And so then to find the third deck for this lineup, where we've ended up landing on is is discard aggro. So
Yeah.
discard aggro is it's 57% against spiders, which is really good. It's even against discard, which is pretty good, really. Like, you look at the matchup spread, being even against discard is not bad at all. And it's 54% against Nightfall. And there's not really many decks that we can find, looking at the data, looking at our personal experiences, that have a matchup spread that good against the three aggro decks.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those things where you could make a lineup which was better against those three aggro decks, but you would just make yourself so much worse against the field. So this is kind of three decks which are strong against those aggro decks while still not being, completely unplayable, huge liabilities where, you've just jammed every card with lifelink into a deck and hoped for the best.
Yeah, I don't even know if that's necessarily that true. I don't know. I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure if there are... Like, I know Go Hard is probably one you're looking at. That's really good against spiders and pretty good against discard, but it's a dog against Nightfall. I'm just not sure if there's other decks that are good. I'm trying to do some...
I mean, I feel like if you just built three Shadow Isles decks, you could probably tune them to the point where you're favored against all of these decks and pretty much a dog to the rest of the field if you don't face off against, triple aggro or something like that. I guess that's the only real weakness to having discard aggro in our anti-aggro lineup, is that we run the risk of our opponent has three decks which they've super tuned to beat aggro, and now we have that as a vulnerability in our lineup. So I think that's the only real weakness to having discard aggro here. But yeah, I think you could build decks to beat aggro. You could tune decks to beat aggro, but I feel like you're just giving up so much that if people actually do that at the tournament, it's probably not going to be worth it. Just because the field is so wide, and I guarantee you're going to play against people who don't have aggro in their lineups. Yeah,
like, it's interesting. Like, I don't know if you can really, and trust me, I've tried this before, just put together random SI piles of nothing to try and beat aggro decks. And I don't know, you sort of still need a cohesive deck and a way to win the game. Like, I do think some existing shells, like Thresh Nasus, for example, like, you can just put some more Withering Rails and some more anti-aggro tools into that, and that will definitely up your numbers. I'm not sure if Nightfall aggro, though, like, that's just a really tough one where I don't know if you can swing the needle that much in that lineup. It just attacks on a bit of a different axis. But yeah, you definitely can. Like, these are just stock lists and stock stats that we're looking at from the ladder. So once you start to update and tweak those, you definitely can have a big impact. And that's where a lot of the skill and the different word for skill that is needed to do well in the seasonals really comes through, and where I think the community's at still at, by and large, a primitive stage when it comes to being able to separate decks that are good on ladder and then decks you should take to your seasonal, because there really should be, in terms of card choices, vast differences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that Diana, Nocturne, Nightfall is a bit, harder to just beat with the random SI cards, but you only have to beat 2 out of the 3 decks. So you get to ban, the Diana Nightfall deck. I mean, you could end up in trouble if your opponent brings Spiders, Diana, Nocturne, and something like Azir Lucian, and then they've got a triple aggro lineup, which, doesn't really get beaten by the Withering Whales, but is worse against, sort of the rest of the field. So, I don't know, it's interesting. Aggro's in a really, really strong spot at the moment where it has enough potential options that it can run, that it can sort of get around some of those cards. So I definitely get what you're saying, but I think, yeah, I don't know. I feel like those old Vi Shadow Isle decks that were just a bunch of removal could be pretty strong again if you were just trying to hit aggro and nothing else.
Yeah, but you're speaking from. I totally understand and respect your opinion, but I've lost a lot of games. I've lost a lot of games with those decks.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely one of those things, where you're just putting all of your resources into this basket. You're like, all right, I'm going to beat up on aggro. I'm going to give up all of this equity in these other matchups. And then, at the end of the day, you're 63% against aggro.
Exactly.
Was it worth it?
You play these games on the ladder where you just get destroyed by Swain decks, and then you get matched into aggro, and sometimes you lose, and you're just like, this is the whole point.
Yeah.
This is what it's all for. And that's what I sort of feel like about the Trundle Liz, the anti-aggro lineups at the moment, is I just feel like if you ran into triple aggro decks every round, then you're laughing. But as soon as you hit someone that's got, I don't know, Tarmkench Taraka or Scargrounds or, Lucian Azir, these are very popular decks that people like and play a lot. And, you're not just going to see triple lineup. There's going to be some random other things. And I just feel like when you've got Trundle Lissandra, you want to see a very specific section of the meta. And it just feels to me like it's unlikely that the pairings you have at the season are going to unveil themselves in such a way that I feel glad that I brought that deck or that sort of very anti-aggro lineup.
Yeah, agreed. I think going all in on targeting specific decks is, just a massive risk. Particularly, there have only been 2 seasonals, but, both seasonals, my opponents just, didn't have decks that I was expecting to be a huge part of the metagame. So, for instance, in one of the tournaments, Go Hard was absolutely dominating the meta. I played against it in 1 of 5 rounds. And the other tournament, I think I played against Fizz TF in maybe 3 of 5 rounds or 2 of 5 rounds. So it's your opponents are smart. They know what's being targeted as well. They're going to tune their decks, and some of the time they're just going to jam it even though they know it's going to be targeted, and that's still definitely going to be the right decision from them. And even with a 60% win rate, you're still going to lose 4 out of 10 times. You're still barely a favorite. So just keep that in mind. Obviously every percentage point counts. You definitely want to be the favorite in every matchup that you can, and it's about looking at tournaments in the long run. So even though all my matchups were great, I was 60% in all of them, but I lost this round. But if you do that across 50 tournaments, that's when you start putting up results. That's when that starts to really matter. So definitely have a long-term perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to have strong reads on the meta, and particularly in something like the seasonal where the 3 decks is just so different to if everyone just brought one deck. It's the variance and the amount of possibilities that people can have has tripled. That's probably more than that, but I don't know what the exact factor is. It's a lot more. A funny anecdote. Did you play at the GP Melbourne, the Eldrazi Winter GP?
No, I didn't. Did you?
I came second. One of my mates...
Nice. I was giving you the brag shot. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. You set me up. One of the point is one of my mates played in it, and this GP was messed up, and there was a blue-white Eldrazi deck, which is one of the strongest decks that Magic's ever had in any format ever. It was ridiculous, and it was incredibly played, and yet one of my mates top-8'd without playing against the deck once in the 16 rounds. Which was very gas.
Pretty unlikely, yeah.
Yeah, but it's made it hard for me to get a good read on the metas as well from the seasonal, because I feel like our experiences, the sample size we only really have is our experiences and then the data that we see and everything, and our experiences have always been so different in terms of what we face against, and I guess what you can determine from that is that the metas are wide, and it's very difficult to it's difficult to target something, I think, in particular. And so that's not necessarily a good strategy, I think. Unless you're targeting, like, if you're targeting like broad swathes of the meta, then that can be powerful. But yeah, you want to try and make yourself a bit stronger against sort of the field, I think, in Runeterra, as opposed to, especially this meta.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it can be easy to start second guessing yourself and really just being like, oh, I can't play this because my opponent might bring this very specific lineup, or have to target this deck because everyone.
Can you imagine not second guessing yourself?
No, I can't. I just I'm not capable. But it would be nice. But yeah. But I honestly think another really good strategy is just to try to build a lineup which isn't exploitable. So rather than focusing super hard on, wow, I've got to try to beat these decks that might come up, just trying to build a lineup where, it's hard for your opponent to really target you, or you don't have any disastrous weaknesses. I mean, when I'm talking about this kind of lineup as well, I'm thinking in terms of, you still want your decks to share some strengths and weaknesses. You don't want to end up in a position where, I have a balanced lineup because, some of my decks are really good against Trundle Lissandra and others are really bad against it. Like, that's sort of the worst thing you can do. You don't want to have to, ban a deck that's, the best matchup for one or two of your decks and the worst matchup for another. So
yeah.
I honestly think that can be a really strong strategy. And, I mean, if I might do something crazy this seasonal, or I might just go for something safe and just try to play a lineup with 3 good decks that don't get completely crushed,
Here we go. So what are you thinking from a seasonal perspective? If the seasonal was tomorrow, what would you be looking to register? I was just looking at this data and I was like, wow, the Sun Disc has incredible matchup spreads. What's this? But I was looking at the wrong way around, and just every deck in the meta you can think of
just beats it. Yeah.
Yeah, so bad.
Found the best deck, yeah. Yeah. Alright, so if the seasonal was tomorrow, I think I would be leaning towards probably playing some sort of aggressive lineup. Maybe not triple aggro, but I think discard aggro is reasonably well positioned. I mean, I'm interested. There are a few other decks that I think you could sort of build around or have as a starting point, which I think could be pretty strong. So Nasus Thresh is one that I'm really interested in at the moment. It seems just like an all-around strong deck. It's got pretty good matchups. It's just a winning deck as well, which I think is just, a really good place to be. You just want to pick decks which are good, because you never know what your opponents are going to bring. Just because your decks are good against the meta decks doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be good against these weird decks. But, I mean, I think that was the biggest strength of Fiora Shen, for instance. Deny and Fiora just beat so many, weird decks and brews that it really was a strong and safe tournament pick for that reason. And at the moment, I mean, you could play the J4 Shen deck to sort of fill that void, but it just feels like a bit of a weaker deck overall, so I'm not as sold on that, and it's not, as good against some of the aggro decks, but that's something that you could potentially build around. Zoe Lee is also this sort of omnipresent deck that, if you're a master, it's just one of the best tournament decks you can play, but outside of that, it's not great. I mean, that deck traditionally hasn't been that good against aggressive decks as well, so I'm not sure if this is the tournament for Zoe Lee, but it's something that I would also be looking at. And then I think another deck which I think might be ready to sort of rise to the top again is the Scouts deck. So traditional MF Quinn Scouts, I think it's got some strong matchups. I think, another strength for the deck is it doesn't really have that many weaknesses, or its weaknesses aren't decks which I'm expecting to show up that much, so it gets dumpstered by, Ash, Draven Ez, which might see some play, and then stuff like the Scargrounds, but, it's hard to imagine an opponent running all 3 of those decks in their lineup, or 2 of those 3 decks in their lineup, so it's not that big of a risk, but that's sort of where I'd be looking at the moment. I'm definitely interested to see what lineups people win with in the Last Chance qualifier as sort of a way to maybe help push me towards some certain lineups. But yeah, if I had to play tomorrow, I'd probably be leaning towards aggressive decks rather than anti-aggro decks.
Yeah. As I've said, I feel the same. It just feels like it's very difficult to build good lineups that beat aggressive decks and don't just fold when your opponent plays Stone Cold anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, especially over 9 rounds as well.
Oh, that's right, the 9 rounds now. And it's moved to a Saturday, I believe, this season.
Yeah, that's right. So the days changed, but we still don't know the time the tournament's going to start yet, which, honestly, as an Australian, is super important because the tournament was starting at 8 a.m., which was, like, perfect for us, and we had to come and register between, 7 and 8. But one issue that Australia generally has when it comes to online tournaments is that the time zones are just horrendous for us. So, particularly with Magic the Gathering, most big tournaments would start at, like, 2 to 4 a.m., which is like the worst possible time for them to start. So that's been pretty horrendous. And yeah, hopefully, given that we've got 4 extra rounds, the tournament doesn't start 4 hours earlier at 4 a.m. I'm really hoping that Riot will sort of take our time zone into account somewhat, but we'll have to see what happens because, I mean, that's the sort of thing that's going to make myself and a lot of other Aussies question whether we, can play these tournaments and if we want to play them. So really hoping that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the start time. And I mean, just also the length of the tournament. I know that they've reduced the time of the rounds a small amount, so that it hasn't really doubled the length of the tournament, but it is just so much longer. And so that also...
Yeah.
I'm getting old. I'm not... 9 rounds is a big ask, but we'll see how it goes. We'll see when we get some more information. I did quite like just the setup of the old format. I'm very confused about why it worked out so well for us time-wise. I don't really understand, considering, like you said, every Magic tournament I've ever played online has always been at a miserable time. And so I'm not sure
literally all of them.
I'm not sure why this one was good. Like, does that mean it was just a terrible time zone for America? That seems odd.
I think they were starting at midday because it was 5 rounds, whereas the Magic tournaments, I think a lot of those tournaments were like, 8 rounds and then a top 8 cut. So they would go for possibly like 11 to 12 hours if you're going to win. So in the States, they had to sort of start a bit earlier for that. But honestly, so does that I really liked 5 rounds.
Oh, it was so good. Does that mean they'll be looking to push the start time out further as opposed to push the end time out further and keep the same start time? Would probably be my guess. But we'll see what they do. And I think the biggest problem people had, and you sort of mentioned before about how you really need to keep your win rate. If you're good at the game and you have a good win rate, it's really just about playing in enough tournaments to get good results. And if you're playing a lot of tournaments and not getting good results, then you probably need to work on how well you're playing. And the problem that Law currently has at the moment is that it only really has one official tournament series, which is a tournament every couple of months. And so people want a lot of stuff from a competitive scene, and the fact that there's only infrequent tournaments at the moment, people are sort of trying to want everything. And I think that there should be other sorts of tournaments and other types of things and stuff, but I think the season as it was, I thought was a brilliant tournament and performed a great function, but I can understand that, people want more chances to do well and they want longer tournaments and stuff. And so, hopefully some other things come in and people can start to get other competitive outlets and there can be a bigger tournament scene and worlds and all that sort of good stuff.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'm really hoping that it keeps expanding. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens. And yeah, Riot have been pretty cool when it comes to Australia so far. So, I mean, even changing the day of the tournament so that it's a day earlier, because for us in Australia, we had to take a Monday morning off work or, figure out some other way to play while working from home. So yeah, that day change is really good for us. So hopefully they don't change the time too much.
Yeah, we'll just have to see how we go. Is there anything else from a lineup perspective? Like you said, I'm pretty excited to see what people play and qualify with this weekend. I think it's really cool to move that qualified tournament before the seasonal, so that we do get some results and we can see what's going on and get a look into that sort of meta. I think that's a really cool adjustment.
Yeah, honestly, I kind of liked that the ladder locked in first and then you had the last chance qualifier, because like calling it the last chance qualifier when like 2/3 of the slots are still open, you can qualify,
Yeah, that's that's a bit weird. Yeah, like the last chance qualifier is going to happen, and then after that, I'm going to try and qualify through the ladder.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, interesting change there, and I did kind of like that of like, oh, okay, I missed on the ladder, so I guess now I can try and get through with the gauntlet. Whereas I feel like, yeah, it's kind of a bit awkward now with the ladder, because you'll be sort of in a position where if you're really close to the threshold, which I suspect is still probably going to be around 150 LP this time around, yeah, you're going to be incentivized to potentially not play still. But, oh well, yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. All right. Was there anything else Runeterra-wise we wanted to discuss this week, or should we have an un-Runeterra associated chat? Are there any cool decks you've seen recently that you'd like to highlight?
I
feel like the meta's sort of really
a go hard list today.
You've been very excited about go hard today.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just got destroyed by it when I played against it. My opponent was like super tuned for aggro. Like they had like multiple copies of the box, like Withering Whale, just a bunch of like good tools, and then they just killed me with a Dreadway into Ledros, and I was like, all right.
Yeah.
That seemed pretty good. So, yeah, it's definitely a deck that, yeah, we'll see. Hopefully it comes back in some way. I used to love that deck, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool that historically Go Hard was sometimes playing Dreadway and pretty much always playing Ledros, and then now cards that it was already playing are like an instant win combo. I think that's a really cool thing that's happened to the deck. It does still have some dicey matchups across the board, and it's got some good ones. It's definitely an interesting option to consider for the seasonal.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of deck at the moment which is probably much better as a tournament deck than a ladder deck, just because, some of its matchups are just horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, any deck with a less than 50% win rate.
Yeah, it's not doing great. Yeah,
it's probably not the best call for ladder play. Yeah, I've just been playing. My laptop I was having a lot of issues with it, where it was the CPU was hitting 100 degrees and it was just turning off, and that wasn't great. And when I took it in, I like showed the guy and was like, yeah, you can see the the like rubber strips a laptop has on the bottom to like give it grip.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, those had melted off because it was just overheating so much. And I like showed that to the guy and he was like, well, that's not good. And,
that's not good.
Yeah.
Technical expert there. That's
Yeah. And I got really like emasculated as well. I like went through all the stuff that I'd like tried to fix it, and the guy just like without even looking at me was like, all the basic stuff then.
Oh. Brutal.
So rough. So my laptop's out of action, and I've been downloaded Slay the Spire on my tablet, which I've played infinite hours of on computer, and now I've got it on tablet. I'm working my way through the Ascensions again, and God, that game's it's such a delight. What a game. Highly recommend if you like card games or roguelites, or even if you don't, you're listening to a card game podcast, so you're probably at least somewhat interested in card games. I would highly recommend you check out Slay the Spire. It's just one of the best games I've ever played.
Yeah, it's just an unreal good game. And for anybody who, hasn't played a game like that, it's basically like a single player card game. It's very similar to the Lab of Legends, but just like a game made out of the Lab of Legends. It's like fully fleshed out, like really good. And yeah, super replayable, very cheap game. And yeah, I've sunk hundreds of hours into it as well. It's just great fun. So definitely recommend you check it out if you're looking for a new game.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the deeper you get into it, I think just the more interesting it gets, and how different it is to, I think, what you expect a card game like that to be. I think one of the common mistakes people make when they start to play is, what decks am I trying to build? As you go through and add cards to your deck, you're like, what decks am I trying to build? And I've watched hours and hours of Jaws, who's basically the best Slay the Spire player in the world, if that was something you could measure. And he has measured in a lot of different ways, and he's incredible. And one of the things that I really learned from him is that you're not trying to build sort of a linear deck. You're trying to answer and solve problems, and so the different fights that you can come up against and the different bosses are different problems that you are solved, and you need different sets of cards and combinations of cards and your relics that you get and your potions to be able to answer those problems. And so and I think that is a really important heuristic that takes a while, because it's quite different when you come from a card game like Magic or Runeterra. You're very sort of used to decks and having a full deck, and that's what you play. But it's quite different in Slay the Spire, how you need to acquire decks, and as you're acquiring decks, you need to be constantly thinking about what problems your deck's going to be faced with in the short term and the long term.
Yeah, it's just a great game. It's super deep, and I don't know, it's one of those games that's really simple to pick up and play and really hard to master. So it's basically like the perfect style of game. Like, I know when I first picked it up, I just couldn't beat it. I just kept losing for quite a while before starting to figure things out. And yeah, it's just super deep. Great game.
Yeah, I was so bad for so long. It's funny because there's like the static value of cards changes constantly, and so I'd have runs where I would like assemble being able to get infinite block, and so I just never take damage, and there's certain cards that you need to get that, and so when I was offered those cards early on, I'd take them and try and build towards that deck, but those cards don't do anything in the first act, and so you just get destroyed by the monsters and lose over and over and over.
Yeah, that's definitely a real learning curve there. But yeah, it's just a great game, and the fact that you can just play it again and again, and you'll never have the same run. Even though I've definitely chased that dream where I've put together a sweet deck, and then the next 5 runs I'm just trying to build that deck again, and it just never works. It just never happens.
Oh yeah. So. Oh yeah, I mean, sometimes on floor 1 as defect, you get offered the claw, and you're just like, is this a claw run?
Nice.
Cool. What else has been going on with you? I've really just been working in Slay the Spire, that's it.
Yeah, I'm pretty much the same. I've been, I picked up a couple of weeks ago. It's like an idle game, so you just leave it on in the background and it plays itself. And I thought I'd play it for a day and give up, but it's now been on for 2 weeks, so I've been playing Idle Champions in the background, so definitely a thoughtless sort of style of game if you're into that, but something to open up and feel like you're progressing when really you're not really doing anything. So
you say thoughtless, but last time we had a Discord Runeterra sesh, you were definitely 90% focused on Idle Heroes and 10% focused on me trying to win a game.
But we did win that game, so it was fine.
Well, we did some incredible wins in that session.
Yeah, I also can't remember if we won the game, but was pretty sure you wouldn't either, so it was safe to say.
All right, I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. So, follow us on Twitter and everything. Join the Discord. We'll be discussing when the Last Chance Qualifier happens. We'll be talking about all the different decks that do well and what happens out of there. And I think it could be interesting to see, if that has a big impact on the ladder meta or where we go for the seasonal from there. So it'll be quite interesting to see what happens this weekend.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, huge shout out to everybody on the Discord. A lot of people have been super active in there, and it's been great to see. I think people are planning on, playing some scrims and jamming tournament lineups over the next week or so. So if that's something you're interested in, please come and join us. Check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks to Dr. Law for putting together that analysis. It's unreal. We'll link it in the show notes, and yeah, take it all in, because there's a lot of really good analysis there. And one of the most important things that he's done is Mobalytics, splits decks up sometimes, so you'll have two different lots of Trundle Liz decks because they have a few cards different, and he's collated that, so it's a really complete set of data that you can't see on Mobalytics easily.
Very nice.
All right, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.